More than 2,000 years have passed. Yet one morning on a Galilean hill still flows in the bloodstream of this world, not through books, but through the silent pulse of souls still yearning for a kingdom not built of stone, but of mercy. That morning began without trumpets, without declarations. It came in the breath of wind threading through olive branches, in the choked hush of a crowd, peasants wrapped in coarse cloth, mothers nursing children without enough milk, the blind and the crippled seated beside thieves who once tasted blood. No one there was important. No one there deserved to be taught. And still, they came, drawn by whispers of a man unlike any they had ever known. Not a king, not a priest, not a soldier, just a carpenter from a place no one ever mentioned. He did not stand. He did not climb a platform. He simply sat on a sunlit stone, dust-covered and still. No one could explain why the crowd fell so silent. Perhaps it was his eyes, or perhaps he carried with him a silence the world had long forgotten. Then he opened his mouth. No shouting, no threats, just a single sentence. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. One sentence like a blade of quiet that severed everything they had ever called blessed. One sentence and the foundations of power and religion began to crack. For the first time, the poor were not despised. The broken were not cast out. The forgotten were no longer invisible. A kingdom was proclaimed not by decree, but by a gaze that saw straight into the soul. And from that sentence, the earth shivered. No thunder was heard, but inside each one, seated there, something collapsed. Statues of virtue, ladders of righteousness, the empire's idea of worth, all shaken. No one left. No one interrupted. Because somehow in a way no words could explain, they knew they were being called. Not with majesty, but with the gentleness of someone who had known suffering. And so it began. A sermon not of advice, not of lessons, but of revolution. Silent, yet total. A manifesto for the buried. A small flame that burned down an old world. That morning wind still moves across the centuries, through unsteady rooftops, into hearts not yet at peace, but on that Galilean hill, when the Lord sat down and the first word fell from his lips. Time seemed to stop. No one knew that this sentence, simple as breath, would become the sharpest blade to ever cut to the soul of mankind. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. From the back of the crowd, a boy, all bones and hunger, clung to his mother's hand, his eyes sunken, but lit up at the word, blessed. Beside him, an old man, hesitant, rose on a splintered staff not out of eagerness, but disbelief. Blessed who these torn and tired ones, him a man who'd spent a whole life never affording a single offering fit for the temple. When he said, poor in spirit, no one had to ask what it meant. They knew, because they were it. No one there had been praised by the world. No education, no lineage, no wealth, no standing. But at those words, something within them, something slandered, buried, began to rise. The truth that their emptiness was not the end, but the beginning. A widow who had prayed so silently, she no longer believed her own words, wept for the first time, not from pain, but from being seen. No one had ever called her blessed. No priest had ever lowered his gaze to the dust where she knelt. But now, a man, seated in the dirt, named her lack as a gate. Heaven is not for those who win. It is for those who know they have nothing. And it is in that place, the deepest hollow of the soul, that the kingdom begins to take root. People once believed that to enter heaven you had to obey every law, bring every offering, be anointed, be a man, be of good name, do more than others. But on that hill, on that day, a man without title stripped the lie from the whole system with a single sentence. He did not need to prove it. He only needed to say what every soul had always known but never dared believe. That spiritual poverty is the place God chooses to dwell. A young man, once ready to hang himself after being cast out for leprosy, grew still. No one had touched him in years. No one had looked into his eyes, let alone called him anything like blessed. But that day, he felt a hand brush against his decaying skin. Not of flesh, but of meaning. The carpenter didn't ask anyone to do anything. He simply redrew the map. A map where the weak are the foundation, and those at the bottom walk first through the gates of heaven. As the sermon went on, people kept weeping, not out of sorrow, but because, for the first time in their lives, someone had dared to declare that the very hole in their soul, the one they had hidden in shame, was the place God would begin building his kingdom. And so, a new world began to form. Not with hands, but with hollow hearts. Not with temples, but with the trembling that comes when you realize you are not enough, and somehow, because of that, you have been chosen. Blessed are the empty, for it is that very emptiness that whispers heaven's invitation. On that hillside, after the first word fell like a seed into the cracked soil of the earth, the Lord paused, not to breathe, but as if he were listening for the echo inside each soul. A different silence fell, not because they didn't understand, but because they were about to hear what no teacher had ever dared say, that sorrow is not a punishment. And then he spoke, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." A quiet wave moved through the crowd, as though he had just spoken the hidden names of everyone there. Some clutched their robes, some buried their faces in their knees. Some covered their mouths to hold back the sob rising too strong. No one had imagined that tears could lead to blessing. A widowed elder, hunched in the shadow of a stone, held close a scrap of cloth once worn by the child she lost to hunger last autumn. She had never dared weep aloud. They told her tears were useless, that strength was silence, that weeping was weakness, a sign of little faith. But now, as she heard the Holy One himself say, "Those who mourn shall be comforted," she felt herself being lifted not by hands, but by compassion. Across the crowd, a father wrapped bandages around his legs, silent since the day he failed to save his wife and children from the fire. He had told himself he no longer had tears, but now his eyes blurred not from ash, but because he had just heard something no temple wall had ever dared inscribe. That God does not only love the strong, he stoops low for the broken. In the crowd, a Roman soldier without armor, his face hidden beneath a cloak. He had come out of curiosity, but when he heard that those who weep are called blessed, his hands began to tremble. He had killed, and in the night, alone, he had wept. But they told him a soldier's tears are shame. Now, his chest tightened, because some small part of him believed that maybe both the blood he had shed and the tears he had hidden could still be reached by a mercy that rose above law and empire. Jesus did not preach an escape from grief. He did not tell them to forget, to swallow pain, or to keep silent. He did not praise false smiles or call stoic endurance a virtue. He declared that sorrow has a place in his kingdom, that not one tear falls without heaven hearing it. The comfort he promised was not a pat on the head, nor a shallow hope. It was presence. It was an arm around the soul's fracture. It was a whisper from within. I have seen, I am still here, and you do not cry alone. When the Lord fell silent, no one clapped. But from the hillside, they began to hear the sound of weeping, not of despair, but of souls who, for the first time, were allowed to hurt. And in that moment, comfort did not come through changed circumstances. It came through knowing that their pain was not forgotten, that someone was watching not with the eyes of a judge, but with the gaze of a father. Blessed are those who weep, for it is in their sobs that heaven leans close to the earth, and it is there that God begins to mend a broken world. After the sound of weeping came a different silence, not from a lack of words, but from exhaustion. Some pains had passed, but left behind bodies drained, souls muted, no longer resisting. And in that moment, the Lord looked upon the crowd not to teach, but as if staring into the root of all human defiance. Then he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." No one breathed. That sentence ran upstream, and at once, those who had ever lifted a stone, held a blade, or carried fury in their chest stilled. Because in that world, as in this one, meekness was not a virtue, it was a weakness. To the Jews under Roman chains, the meek were trampled. To the revolutionaries, the meek were traitors. To the world, the meek were cowards. But that day, Jesus declared a thunderous paradox. The ones who do not conquer will be the ones who inherit. There stood a broad-shouldered man at the back of the crowd. A scar down his left cheek marked him as a survivor of some failed uprising. His fingers gripped a dagger hidden beneath his robe, ready, at the wrong word, to strike. But when he heard that sentence, his heart softened. He had fought, he had killed, he had bled and been caged and still had nothing. He couldn't explain it, but something in the carpenter's gaze made him loosen his grip just a little. And part of him began to believe there is a kind of power that does not need victory to be unconquerable. Elsewhere in the crowd, a mother held her last child to her chest, 4 others lost to war. She had prayed for fire from heaven, for angels with swords, for vengeance. But when she heard the meek shall inherit the earth, she didn't understand the words, but her trembling arms felt lighter, because for the first time, she imagined that maybe the land could be kept not through blood, but through the quiet of a heart no longer bent on revenge. Meekness is not weakness, it is power, bridled. It is the lion that doesn't roar, because it knows it has nothing left to prove. It is the warrior who knows when not to strike, the one who could retaliate but chooses mercy. Jesus was not exalting cowardice. He was honoring holy restraint, the kind of strength only possible for those who know their human limits and trust divine hands more than their own. And the earth he promised was not just soil or garden. It was inheritance. Not taken but entrusted. Not conquered but kept. What irony for the empire who ruled them. The land would not belong to the oppressors, not to the victorious, but to those who knew when to stop. By now, the sermon was no longer words. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, those who once thought themselves strong saw themselves hollow, while those who feared they were weak began to see a strength no sword could steal. Blessed are the meek, for when the world screams and claws to take everything, they are the only ones silent enough to receive what no one else can touch. A kingdom, granted, not seized. An inheritance born not from dominion, but from faithfulness. The sunlight slipped down the hillside, stretching across the bent shoulders of those leaning into the voice. No one moved, not from weariness, but because their souls had stepped across a threshold. where each word was no longer teaching, but judgment. Then he spoke again, not gently this time. This time, his words broke open like a drumbeat in the heart of night. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. An old woman lifted her face, her hands calloused from tilling, from wiping away blood, from dragging her son's body back from a forgotten field. Righteousness. She had once craved it so fiercely that on a night when no one listened, she struck her own chest until it bled because the sky never answered her cry. A soot-faced child sat alone on the edge of the crowd. He had watched soldiers drag his father into the marketplace, bones broken, for stealing a scrap of bread. Since then, he hated the word justice, because no one ever stood for people like him. But now, he heard this word from a man wearing no robes of power, and something in his eyes lit up like fire, awakening in cold ash. Could it be that righteousness wasn't something above, but a holy hunger burning inside those left behind? Jesus wasn't speaking of courtroom justice, not the polished morality of scribes and priests. He spoke of a hunger born from having seen too much wrong and still daring to long for what's right. He spoke of souls cracked open by their own sins, no longer pretending to be strong, of those who had stared into their own darkness and wept, of those who could no longer boast of their goodness, but lay awake at night with a wound inside them, whispering. The world was meant to be holier than this, and he promised something no one dared to ask for. They shall be filled, not with power, not with conquest, but with a fullness that only comes when heaven answers earth. When righteousness is no longer a dream, but a presence dwelling within. At the back of the crowd, a priest lowered his head. He had preached countless sermons on laws, on virtue, on justice, but never once had anyone cried when he spoke of righteousness. Now, as he looked at tear-soaked faces and trembling hands, he knew what he had preached had never touched what this carpenter had just awakened. Because righteousness, in the mouth of Jesus, was not a system, not a checklist, but a longing deeper than life itself. And he had just vowed to fill it. And that, no one had ever said. Empires taught that the strong would be satisfied. Religions taught that the obedient would be rewarded. But Jesus said, the hungry, the thirsty, the not yet enough, the ones still searching through the rubble, they are the ones who will be given fullness. A man placed his hand over his chest. It beat differently now, not a rage for revenge, but a stillness, like soil waiting for rain. For now he knew to hunger is not to be weak. To hunger is to still be alive. To hunger is to still believe. And that Jesus called blessed? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for that hunger is not a lack, but a sacred signal that a feast is coming. Not for the full, but for the empty. No one in the crowd fully understood every word, but all could feel that each sentence from the carpenter's lips fell like a stone into still water, rippling through the soul, reaching memories they'd tried to bury. Jesus wasn't giving a lecture, he was summoning souls. And then, in the hush that felt like wind holding its breath, he spoke again. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. In that moment, the air itself seemed to turn inside out. That sentence did not match what they had been taught, not what Rome believed, not what the powerful expected. Because mercy had never been power, it was weakness, the shortest path to pain. And yet that day, he declared mercy is the key that unlocks the deepest chambers of God's own heart. A man in the crowd turned away. He was a moneylender. Each week, he walked the villages collecting debts, dragging families into public shame, seizing children as collateral. He had called it justice, But now, his eyes burned. Because when he heard that sentence, he didn't see his victims, he saw himself. And for the first time in his life, he trembled not from rage, but from shame. Closer to the front, a woman sat very still. She had once been caught in adultery, dragged into the street, awaiting stones. Somehow, she had been spared. No one explained why. All she knew was that he had stepped between her and the hands that would kill her. Now she sat alive, breathing, trembling and heard. The merciful shall receive mercy. She had no words, only tears, a kind of gratitude too full for speech. Mercy, as he spoke it, was not a fleeting feeling. It was willful action. It was seeing someone's pain and moving toward it, not out of duty, but because you'd been there. It was forgiving when you held the right to punish. It was extending a hand when walking away would be easier. And then something strange began to happen. From those who had been wounded, cast out, wronged, there came a silent wave of understanding. Because those who have needed mercy know how sacred it is, and those who've received it know it's unjust to keep it for themselves. Jesus wasn't only teaching them to show mercy to strangers, he was inviting them to face their enemies, those who had wounded them, those deserving of judgment, and love them in ways no one else dared, not because they were worthy, but because they themselves had once been spared. At the foot of the hill, a Samaritan crept quietly closer. All his life, he had been despised by Jews, treated as filth, but he had heard whispers of a teacher who did not chase foreigners away. Now he sat among the crowd, hiding, listening, and heard, "Blessed are the merciful," and he understood, though no one had ever shown him mercy. He still had the power to give it, and in doing so, he would no longer be just a victim, but a vessel. As the morning light faded, the air grew lighter and sharper, because now they all knew, blessing does not come to those who keep the law with cold precision. It comes to those who kneel beside another's pain and refuse to let it suffer alone. Blessed are the merciful, for mercy is where heaven comes closest to earth. And when we open our hearts to one another, God opens his heaven to us, through the very same door we opened first, after mercy had touched every unhealed scar. The air on the hillside shifted. People no longer bowed their heads out of shame. They looked up not with pride, but with the first glimmer of hope rising from the ashes of their souls. And then, as if leading them deeper into a temple not made of stone, Jesus continued, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." No one moved. The sentence did not fall like wind, but like light, cutting straight into the shadowed chambers of the heart, because purity, as they knew it, belonged to another world. It was for priests in the temple, for those who had bathed in sacred waters, kept every rule, lived spotless lives, never strayed from a single dot of Moses' law. But today, this carpenter said purity isn't in the hands, it's in the heart. A woman labeled impure, once chased from the village well at high noon, clutched her robe. Her heart had hardened into stone after years of being stared at with disgust. But now, she felt another kind of gaze, and a new thought broke through. Maybe purity was not a spotless past, but a heart brave enough to turn around and long for the sacred again. Beside her, a young man living like a shadow, tormented by desire, disgusted by himself, exhaled for the first time in months. He had thought God saw him as a broken resume, but now he heard, "They shall see God." Not the powerful, not the wealthy, not the ones who quote scripture perfectly, but the ones whose hearts no longer wear masks. Because purity, as Jesus meant it, was not perfection, It was wholeness, undividedness, a heart that no longer plays both sides, not loving God with lips while hiding hate in the corners, not using faith as a cloak to shield guilt, not worshiping outwardly while feeding darkness inwardly. Jesus spoke like someone drawing back a curtain. In the temple, only priests could enter the Holy of Holies. But here, on this hillside, he said those with honest hearts will see God's face. No intermediary, no law, no animal sacrifice, just sight, given freely to a heart no longer hidden. A child sat in his father's lap, wide-eyed, not understanding the words but bathed in the light of afternoon. That child's gaze, clear as glass, was its own silent confirmation God still shows up in simplicity, in hearts that haven't learned to deceive, to manipulate, to guard. And then some began to realize why they had never seen God. It wasn't because he was hiding. It was because they had built too many mirrors reflecting only themselves, worshiping their own fear, their own ego, their own image. They searched for God in rituals, but not in the one place he had always chosen to dwell, an undivided heart. Jesus condemned no one. He simply held up the mirror, and in it, those who dared face the murk within found something strange. God had never left the soul. He was only waiting for a place clear enough to be seen. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will not just see God in the next life. They will see him now in their neighbor, in kind words, in forgiveness, in eyes that no longer hide. For only when the heart stops pretending can light enter, and the God who has always stood waiting finally comes into view. The sky had turned honey-colored, pouring gold over every bowed head. The hillside of Galilee no longer felt like a place but a sanctuary. They sat upon dust, yet their souls seemed to kneel before a throne not of this world. And then, in that slant of golden light, Jesus spoke a sentence like a blade cutting through every rooted conflict in the human heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Not lovers of peace, not those who wait for others to create it, but builders, makers, the ones who dare step into the fire and plant what no one else dares to plant. A young man clenched his jaw. He had once belonged to the zealots, a faction that believed only blood could buy freedom. Each night, he sharpened vengeance like a blade. But now, Jesus' words were peeling the armor from his soul. Because for the first time, he heard children of God are not the victors. They are the ones who bring peace where others bring war. Across the crowd, a Samaritan woman sat still. She had watched her brother be cast out by the Jews and carried that bitterness for years. She had prayed for wrath to fall on those who mocked her family. But now, she began to understand. If she continued demanding justice through revenge, who would be the first to sow a different kind of seed? Jesus didn't say peace like a slogan. He didn't lull them with empty comfort. He drove them into the heart of their own war between justice and mercy, between answering hatred or ending it with a blood-stained embrace. Children of God, not a title of purity, not a certificate of belief, but the mark of those who resemble their Father. A creator who spoke, not struck, a redeemer who shattered war not with a sword but with a cross. When he said it, hearts began to thaw, ancient feuds, spoken curses, generational rage all started to melt under something quiet, but undeniable. To make peace, you don't need power. You need the courage to give up your right to strike back, to stand in the divide and be called traitor by both sides because you chose not to hate, to carry the weight of seeming weak in front of others just to protect a fragile seed of gentleness. Peace, as Jesus defined it, was not silence. It was a whisper amid the crowd's roar, a hand extended between those who'd once killed with a glance, a sorry from someone not in the wrong, just tired of blood. It was the choice to lose, so that a wound would not pass into the next generation. And he promised those who dare to do this will be called children of God, not by the world but by the one above, who once chose forgiveness over judgment, nails over retaliation. Blessed are the peacemakers, for in a world that loves to strike the match, they carry water. In a field full of blades, they are the first to sow a seed. And when the world asks, "Who are you to be so soft?" heaven answers, "Mine, on the hill of Galilee." The evening light stretched like a cloak from heaven, covering the still bodies of those who had sat for hours like wanderers who had found an ancient well in the desert. The sermon did not end. It did not close with comfort, but with a sacred warning, like a final bell to reveal who would truly remain. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then he went even further, into the place no one dared touch the inevitable pain of walking the path of truth. Blessed are you when they insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. Those words fell like an earthquake. No one blesses the shamed. No one celebrates the outcast, the accused, the beaten, the ridiculed for believing in something unseen. But today, the carpenter stood among the rejected and handed them a kingdom. A young girl curled at the edge of the crowd, cast out by her father for refusing an arranged marriage. Because she clung to the name of one God, she had once dreamed of a hand on her shoulder saying she was not alone. Now, hearing his voice, she knew he was that hand. An old man still carried the lash marks on his back. He had refused to offer coins to a Roman idol and was stripped in the public square, not for wrongdoing, but for daring to live otherwise. He had stayed silent, resigned. But now he heard his name called by heaven itself, persecuted for righteousness, and the kingdom was his. Jesus did not invite them onto a soft path. He pointed out the stones, the blood, the darkness ahead, and called it glory. Not by promising safety, but by promising presence. He did not promise they would be understood. He did not promise truth would be welcomed. He did not promise goodness would be repaid with gratitude. He promised one thing: if you walk in light, darkness will rise to meet you. And when it does, do not fear. It is the sign that you belong to a kingdom not drawn on human maps. For the kingdom of heaven is not for the safe. It is for the brave, those who live true, though the cost is loneliness, shame, or death. Across the crowd, eyes met. Those who had been expelled from synagogues, banned from wells, abandoned by family. They said nothing, but inside, something ignited. They were not victims. They were witnesses, not forgotten but recorded in the scrolls of heaven. And then, with the breath of the earth, his final words rang out like a bell to awaken the sleeping soul. You are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. The ones once called useless, unworthy, unfit now called salt, that which preserves life, holds back decay. Those locked in shadow now called light, not because they blazed brightly, but because they refused to go out. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for they prove that truth does not need a crowd to stand. For every scar they carry is an inscription written into the eternal history of heaven. And if the world continues to slander them, cast them out, or kill them, then when the gates of heaven open, there will be a voice that says, "Come, you lived true. What is mine is now yours." The sun had begun its descent. casting the dust in the air with the glow of blood and gold. And yet the crowd did not move. Though their bodies ached, though hunger gnawed, no one shifted, because they knew what was being spoken was not teaching. It was life itself. And in that hush that felt like a shared prayer, Jesus brought them to the edge of everything he had just said. He did not end with comfort. He did not paint heaven as a prize to entice. He ended with a warning, a choice, a picture no one would forget. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down. The floods rose. The winds beat against that house, and it did not fall, because its foundation was on the rock. On that hillside, each listener saw themselves in that image. A house, a storm, a foundation. No one is immune to storms. Not even the righteous are promised that the winds will pass them by. The only difference is what they're standing on. The storm will come, not if, but when. The storm of betrayal, the storm of grief, the illness that arrives unannounced, the silence that follows unanswered prayer. And when that moment comes, the house built on wealth, on pride, on half-held religion will fall. Then he added, "But everyone who hears these words and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds struck, and the house collapsed, and great was its fall." This was no threat. It was truth, truth not clothed in religion, but soaked in flesh and bone. Some in the crowd had already built on sand, on fleeting glory, on inflated pride, on inherited beliefs that held no weight. And they knew, when the winds came, they had fallen. But today they were invited to build again, not with outer stone, but with quiet choices, mercy, truth, forgiveness, trust. An elderly woman gripped her granddaughter's hand, trembling. Her eyes looked far off, as if already seeing the storm ahead. But in her chest there was no fear, only a whisper. You will stand, if you build on him. Jesus looked at each face. He did not ask for admiration. He asked for obedience, because he knew truth doesn't live in lips, but in how we walk. And love isn't real if it cannot stand in the rain. When the sermon ended, no one applauded, no one cheered, only silence so deep that even the wind held its breath. A small boy turned to his father and asked, "Dad, what is the rock?" The father looked down into his son's wide eyes and pointed to his chest. "Here, if you keep it straight." And high on that hill, the carpenter stood still. His eyes looked far, as if already watching the greatest storm approach. The cross, the betrayal, heaven's silence. He too would face the storm. But because he was the rock, he would not break. Blessed are those who build their lives upon the rock. Not because they won't fall, but because when the storm comes, they will stand. And in that standing, the world will know there is a kingdom that cannot be shaken. There is a word that holds, not for a religion, but for a soul walking through the wind. And if you're still here, among the ancient whispers of stone and dust, between the embers of words that once fell like sacred ash from the mouth of the one who sat upon that rock, then perhaps your soul has just been called. Not by thunder, not by light from the sky, but by a voice so gentle, it could be missed. Blessed are, and from that moment, something in you began to shift. Not because you found the answers, but because you dared to ask the right questions. About righteousness, about mercy, about rock and wind, about what still stands when all else collapses. The Sermon on the Mount was never a lesson. It was a summons, not to the crowd, but to the one who stayed until the very end. And if you heard something not with your ears, but with your heart, then please don't keep it to yourself. Give this word to someone who's weary, to someone who thinks blessing is something they've never known, to someone building on sand and doesn't even realize it. At Tales of Black, every story is a ritual, a torch passed through the dark, a reminder. Blessing isn't for the perfect, it's for the ones who don't quit. If you've ever been forgotten, cast out, told you're no longer among the chosen, remember this. The carpenter is still speaking, and the kingdom is still open. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you carry a memory, a dream, or a nameless nightmare, leave it in the comments. Because who knows, your story might just become the next ritual we raise together. On the mountain, in the wind, by a voice no storm can silence,